Okay, I'm starting. Last time I spoke was on the 6 degrees of truth, because we were talking about the levels of the mind, of which generally they break down into 3 levels and then they get subdivided. So I was talking about the truth, and this time I'm going to be talking about the other side of the story, which is the good. Mainly with charity, because there are 6 types of charity, which I'll be reading. But I'm not going to stick with charity. I'm going to go political, as you'll see. Politically non-political. So I'm warning you ahead of time. Now, from the Arcana Celestia, 6,819. Not only is an individual person the neighbor, but also a multitude of people. For a society, smaller or greater, is the neighbor. Our country is the neighbor. The church is the neighbor. The Lord's kingdom is the neighbor. And so, above all, is the Lord. And all these are the neighbor who is to be benefited from charity. These are also the ascending degrees of the neighbor. That's Arcana Celestia 6,819. There are 6 degrees of the neighbor. These are the individual person, a group of people such as a local community, city, or church organization, one's country, the church, the Lord's kingdom or heaven, and above all, the Lord. These are called ascending degrees of the neighbor, and the higher degrees have priority over the lower degrees in the practice of charity to the neighbor. I'm going to read now from Heaven and Hell 213. As heaven is distinguished into societies, and the larger societies consist of some hundreds of thousands of angels, and as all within a society are in a similar good, but not similar wisdom, it necessarily follows that there are also governments. For order must be observed, and all things of order must be guarded. But the governments of heaven are various. They are of one sort in societies that constitute the Lord's celestial kingdom, and of another sort in societies that constitute the Lord's spiritual kingdom. They differ also in accordance with the functions of the several societies. Nevertheless, no other government than the government of mutual love can operate in the heavens. And the government of mutual love is heavenly government. I might say here that the intention was that heavenly government should come down into the world, into the church, so that ideally the church would be governed by mutual love. But there would be variations in the societies of the church. To continue, what unites people is their mutual love for each other. Those who are in the good of mutual love are in the affection of good for the sake of good. That's from Arcana Celestia 9,741. They place a greater priority on what serves the good of the whole rather than themselves alone. So we read, mutual love consists in this, that they love the neighbor more than themselves, the effect of which is that the whole heaven represents, as it were, one person. For by means of mutual love, all are so consociated by the Lord. Hence it is that the happiness of all are communicated to each one, and those of each one to all. Mutual love or charity causes things, though varied, to be one, for it makes one out of varied things. If all, no matter how many, even tens of thousands times 10,000, are governed by charity or mutual love, they have but one end in view, namely the common good, the Lord's kingdom, and the Lord himself. Arcana Celestial 1285. That same number talks about all had charity, churches would be one. That's one of my favorite passages. As there is such a variety in the governments of heaven, we may wonder if perhaps some of those societies from time to time have elections of their leaders. This is where it gets a little political. For there are civil affairs and civil governments in the heavens. Can you imagine what such an election might look like, with each candidate regarding the others as more qualified? And they have to leave the decision up to the people. That sure would be different than, let's say, that sure would be different than the hellish spectacle that we have going on now in this country. And there is a lesson here for us, which is that even though our candidates and our major political parties may not be displaying such mutual love, that is not a reason that we can't do so. We can still demonstrate mutual love for each other, even though we differ as to religious views, political views. Consider the teaching concerning mutual love that can be applied to our politics. This teaching. All people, no matter how many they may be, even myriads of myriads, if they are in charity or mutual love, have one end, namely the common good, the Lord's kingdom, and the Lord himself. For they acknowledged all who lived in the good of charity, and called them brethren, however they might differ respecting truths. In these they instructed one another, which was among their works of charity. Nor were they indignant if one did not accede to the opinion of another, knowing that everyone receives truth so far as he or she is in good. Can you imagine how that would look in our country today if each one did not become indignant because we had differing views? So you see, we can take the spiritual teachings of the Word and apply their principles to the civil affairs of the world. We might call this bringing the Word down into everyday life, taking heavenly practices described in the Lord's Word and putting them to work in this world, living as though heaven is on the earth, or can be, as it was meant to be. Now, there are 6 degrees of the neighbor. There is, within each of these 6 degrees, 3 degrees or types of good. Remember I was saying that everything perfect is in a trine? You notice the repetition of 3. If I do that 3 times, I might get it right. And these are called in the Word, these 3 degrees or types of good: civil good, moral good, and spiritual good. That's Charity 55. They are forms of natural good, spiritual good, and celestial good, and they correspond to the types of good we find in the 3 heavens. These 3 types of good are present in each of the 3 heavens as well as in the world. Civil good is of charity and is the neighbor, insofar as it is from moral and spiritual good. Likewise, moral good is the neighbor insofar as it is drawn from spiritual good. These degrees of good are from one another and are subordinated the one to the other. In fact, there is no true civil good unless it has within it and is subordinated to moral and spiritual good. Likewise, there is no true moral good unless it has within it and is subordinated to spiritual good. Now, civil good exists not only in this world, it is the ultimate good of heaven. The essence of civil good is the love of what is just and fair. It is the love for what is just and fair that is the very heart and soul of civil good. And a person can only have this good to the degree that he has some perception of what is just and fair from the Lord. When a person has this, he or she comes to love what is just and fair simply because it is just and fair, and not merely as a means of getting along with others for the purpose of pursuing his or her own ends. He recognizes something of a higher good in justice and fairness and places these above his or her own interests. Thus, there is a form of spiritual good within the civil good. Charity number 83 states that our country is the neighbor according to its spiritual, moral, and civil good. As we look at the state of our country, especially as reflected in this present election, we may be wondering, where is this spiritual, moral, and civil good? Perhaps we are wondering this. It may help if we consider that love towards our country as the neighbor is to be subordinated to love towards the church and the Lord's kingdom. So perhaps if we consider what will be of greatest benefit to the church and to the establishment of the Lord's kingdom on earth, together with what will be best for promoting spiritual, moral, and civil good in our country, if we use these things as criteria for our political decisions, perhaps we may have better clarity. But looking beyond the current election, the people in the church have a greater and longer role to play. In practicing love towards our country as our neighbor, we need to be involved in promoting the good of our country and promoting its spiritual, moral, and civil good. We need to take the spiritual goods and truths of the Lord's Word and share them as best we can with our fellow citizens. In this way, we provide for the souls of our fellow citizens and for the spread of the Lord's kingdom in the world. Thank you. Are there comments, questions? It's kind of interesting how the Lord, when he spoke about the denarius, was actually taking something political. Whose image is on this coin? And the scribes and the Pharisees were hoping to trap him in this. Shall we pay taxes to Caesar? And he turned it spiritual. And they couldn't deal with that. And it's the same thing here. The civil and moral and spiritual good can find its way and should find its way into our everyday living and even into our politics. And one of the first things is mutual love, respect for each other, respect for what is just and fair. How that would change the life of the country. But I have to tell you, it would be a disaster for those that make political commercials. It would ruin that section of the economy. Not a bad thing, perhaps. You know, can you imagine some of the politicians who are used to planning their strategy and their ads and saying, people aren't donating anymore. They're hung up on this thing called mutual love and respect for each other. How are we going to make a living? Okay.
Thank you, Hugh. This is Catherine. So I just keep thinking, in the political climate at the moment, that we really are in a master class on how to love our neighbor right now, and really find those ways where we disagree. And we maybe are a bit afraid of what of how things kind of roll down the road, and still be able to find the way of connecting to another human being, and recognizing their humanity and that spark of God within. And we know that the Lord uses all things for good, and so for our part, really working to see if we can stay in that light of love and charity.
Mm-hmm. Roxanne in the back also.
I often find myself struggling with who is my neighbor. And when I'm thinking of the unborn child in the womb, is that my neighbor? When I'm thinking about animals, are they my neighbor? So I'm just wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Yes, it talks about the neighbor as being good. Good itself is the neighbor. So that's why it says the degrees of the neighbor. The Lord is in the highest degree, highest good. But it comes down to the individual. And it can go beyond that. For example, treating an animal fairly, nicely, justly. Well, that animal is our neighbor at that point. The exception is biting dogs and mosquitoes for me. But the neighbors, I would say anything that we can practice good toward. So that it talks about, the Lord and things, you might say, out there are the neighbor, to whom we are to practice good too. But where does the good come from? From the Lord. Reminds me of the song Magic Penny. Love is something, if you give it away, you end up having more. And so if you talk about the unborn, they could be the neighbor to you. if you talk about the individual for whom you really, really, well, I wrote a sermon once. It says, how to love your neighbor when you don't like them. Don't we have sometimes that sort of thing? We know we're supposed to love our neighbor, but boy, do we not like them. I sometimes wonder if it's more charitable simply to not interact with them, because our interactions might be less than, shall we say, loving. Roxanne, does that help answer?
To some degree, yes. Yes, to some degree, but you know, I struggle with the unborn child in that, you know, issues around abortion.
Mm-hmm.
I find that really difficult. Because I do think of the unborn child as my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And also the woman who may want to have an abortion is my neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a tough one.
It's very tough because we want to do the highest good to both.
Yes.
And then we have those difficult decisions. And even getting away from animals and human life, the environment is our neighbor. We need to treat that respectfully and well. You might say justly and fairly. And yet we don't think of that as being the neighbor, but it is the world around us, which was created by God, is meant to be good, meant for our good, and therefore is worthy of being treated with good.
Is Martha next, or?
Martha was there, and Randall was there.
Okay.
I just wondered about, this is Randall, about my good versus or amongst your good. How I am good to the neighbor versus someone else is good to the neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put that in the context of someone that has an unborn child and wants to get rid of it, or, do you know what I'm saying? So that, talking about choice.
Yes, our differing ideas of what is good and what is the higher good. There are some who would go one way with it, what is the higher good, and others that go the other way. And then we have differing opinions that go right down into the civil affairs of the country, into the laws. But do you notice what it was saying here in the one place, that there are governments in heaven? And the reason being is that they're all in mutual love, but they're not in the same wisdom, which means they would be in differing ideas of what is the right thing to do. That's why I was bringing in the possibility, and I don't think it's a possibility, that there could be elections in heaven. And yet, due to the nature of people in heaven, they're in mutual love, and they would tend to defer to the other who they regarded as wiser. And then you would have two individuals, both of whom have somewhat differing opinions, but regarding what they think as opinions. So there's humility there and saying that person is wiser, but the other one says, support my opponent because they're the wiser. I mean, that would really change the dynamics here. But it would be an election out of charity and mutual love. Entirely different sort of thing. That would make an interesting fictional story. Maybe I should do that. Martha.
Yes, this is Martha. I kind of forgot what I was going to say with all this other. I think what I was going to say about regarding the neighbor and how we can make a difference is our attitudes and positive thoughts, what go out into the universe is important. And it's important from each one of us. Not just being like nice to the neighbor and good to the neighbor, but how we treat everything around us, how we treat ourselves, our positive feelings rather than being negative. And I'm a firm believer that the Lord is in control of all of this. I know He is. And if we could feel that peace of the Lord flowing through us, and just feel that peace and present that peace, I think that it would spread. You know, like you said, heaven on earth, it's in the Lord's Prayer too.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Hugh. This is Guard Perry. Thank you, Hugh. So I'll just say something about how I experience the question, particularly the one Martha maybe asked, or it's come up a couple times, is, who is my neighbor? That's one. And how do I love the neighbor? These are universal questions, so we'll all have our own answers. I'll offer mine. So Swedenborg apparently says we are to love the good in the neighbor. And as has come up a few times in a way, I'll speak for myself. The responsibility I feel I have is to define what is good. What is good?
Mm-hmm.
And this will depend on the context. It can be very simple and literal. If I'm walking by and someone having trouble opening a door, I stop, I hold the door open. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
So to have a big question like this, I think I'll just offer my own way of doing it. I simply say, okay, what's the setting? Is this another person? And so this is context dependent. And as has come up, there are some contexts, settings, situations that are troubling. They seem to have no resolution. That's maybe the case. Those are difficult. Many are easy. It's very simple. But I'll give the one that I use as a basic starting point. The one that I believe I find consistent with the fundamental teaching that comes from the Swedenborgian teachings. We are to love the good in the neighbor. What is the good in the neighbor? Well, for Swedenborg, it would be some, and this is the basic context. There are many, many other settings within which this varies. We are to wish for the eternal well-being of the other. Now, if we make that more specific, because he talks about regeneration so much, well, we would want that person to be happy, to be well, to be able to be a benefit to others, and to be benefited by others. How do we help? What can I do? So we kind of have to take a step, I'm speaking for myself, I take a step back and I go, well, what kind of way of being with others do I wish to cultivate? This takes time. This is not situational. This is done on one's own, in your meditation time. There's no context there. Things come up so fast in the world. Once we start our day, anything can happen. And we wind up reacting and reacting instead of responding. This is what hurts the most. I'm speaking for myself. This hurts a lot. If I react to something and I go, oh no, I reacted in a way I wish I had not. Well, that just happens sometimes. Hopefully it's not too bad. But I'll finish this a little bit longer answer than usual. The good in the neighbor from a basic idea in the Swedenborgian teachings is their regeneration. How can I help this neighbor in such a way that it will foster their regeneration? This is the constitutional purpose of the Swedenborgian Church. That's Article 1, Section 1. What is the purpose of the Swedenborgian Church? It is to facilitate the regeneration of others. And of course, that's where your scales begin to come in. One-on-one, person to person. And of course, we wish for the well-being of the people. That's the group. Freiburg Assembly, we want to do our part. Okay, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going on here to maybe I'll just say I did this because I feel it is my responsibility, and perhaps I'm sharing this, to simply take some time, make some definitions for what is good. And the basic one is good is to care about you and to wish for your well-being. And start from there.
Denise.
Hi, Denise here. What strikes me is regarding the good in another is really important, and another really important basic is freedom. I don't know where that stacks up in the order of good or the levels of good, but both the writings and our country's constitution put freedom as a very large underlying pillar, so that no matter what I believe in, what my beliefs are or my opinions are, I have to regard the freedom of another as very important, so that I may compromise my own opinions in order to regard the freedom of another as at least as important as my own thoughts or opinions.
A comment on this. Gard sort of was touching on it. is in regard to good. Now, the teaching is that there's degrees of and levels of good, the Lord being the highest, the individual the lowest, and they're subordinated to each other. So one of the things that American culture has difficulty with is that due to our history, we've tended to put the rights and freedom of the individual high, but not every culture does that. They will preserve the community first. I've seen that in the African places I've been. The community goes first. The individual goes down there. And in this country, we have certain groups and churches that put the welfare of their church community higher than that of the individual in it. And that really seems to be what I see the writings teaching. The welfare of the community, the greater good, how would I say, is more of a higher degree, higher quality, takes priority over that of the individual. And that's, you know, we're not used to that in this country. We want to put the individual first. But if you think about it, and I especially like the Amish for that. The welfare of the Amish communities comes higher. But they have an interesting thing, which is that they're very forgiving, and they, when they do have a disagreement, as disagreements tend to come up in communities, they will tend sometimes to separate in charity. We don't even see that too much in the new church. We tend to go into separations with accusations and my doctrine is better than your doctrine, etc. The Amish go into different branches so that studying a book about the Amish, you will find that there are a whole lot of different Amish groups. You know, could say, and one is called the Beachy Amish, for example, and there are others. And the other is, if you're around Amish communities, different Amish, you may notice that they dress differently. I mean, generally the same, but they may have different color clothes on. Some of the communities may allow cell phones, others don't. That's the community standard, and community standard is what takes priority. And the nice thing is, if you don't agree with the community, you can move on. You have to be accepted into the other one. Now, in heaven, we can't go into just any heavenly community or society just because we want to. It talks about in, I think it's in Conjugal Love, where it talks about there are some societies that put guards around them. You know, and if you don't belong there, you're not allowed in. That sounds kind of uncharitable, but it's because they are preserving something that's very valuable. And we do that in our churches to some degree. Some have looser boundaries, but some have very strict, high boundaries to preserve the good or nature that's in that community. Dave.
Dave Keating. Perhaps it's because I've been raised in America and I do believe in protecting individuals. I couldn't help but think of the Roman Catholic Church And you're brought up from childhood to believe that's the only route to salvation, and the priests are appointed by God. And apparently the Pope and other bishops believed it was better to protect the community than to have it tainted by a couple of priests, being pedophiles. And I think that can be very dangerous if you think, well, it's so important to protect the community. And you mentioned, well, a person can always leave, but if you're brought up to believe that the Catholic Church is the only route to heaven, you can't leave. And a lot of people have been severely injured by that community protecting itself.
Yes. And that's the trade-off. It's very valuable to protect the community, especially the spiritual welfare of the community. At the same time, the individual then takes a lower status. But that, by the way, is also the teaching. The higher good has priority over the lower good. And that's hard for us to do.
I have several, Bob Perry, I have several unfinished thoughts. One that just flashed in front of me, and used the word integrity. The integrity of a community, integrity has more than one definition. The integrity of the community is what? Its structural strength or its goodness? Does a community have integrity if it's protecting pedophiles? No, I would argue it has no integrity. Why would you want to preserve that? What are you accomplishing? It occurred to me, hearing everybody speaking, and thank you, Hugh, for setting the stage, in our current natural world political environment, there is, in the political discourse, the process of otherizing, talking about the other and demonizing the other. And it occurred to me that the other is our neighbor. And if you just stop and think in those terms, suddenly the other is, the wall just comes right down. And we should be loving our neighbor, not demonizing our neighbor. And how do we go about doing that? There's a practice of otherizing migrants, as if they're evil and undesirable. And we should be loving them. Why are they doing what they're doing? They're not attacking us. They're fleeing from something else. And they're desperate and suffering. And to demonize that means that we're not seeing them as our neighbors anymore. And it's just in so many places and in so many ways, it's time to hit the reset button. Take a new mental picture of this group you're looking at and thinking about, and how is it that we are viewing these people? Are we viewing them as others, or are we viewing them as neighbors? And if you just decide to change your viewpoint and see them as neighbors, how it is you approach them, deal with them, the choices that you make, the next decision that you make, what you're going to do when you are interacting with them could change significantly and for the good.
Julie.
Who's next?
Hi, Randall again. I was just thinking, listening to Gardner, and then what Bob said brought in again my thinking. Are we to only love the good in the neighbor?
That's what it says.
Okay.
That gives us a challenge to look for that good.
Yeah, I think if we get too much on judging others, where they exist, and the talk about people having, now I've lost the word. Anyway, The important thing is not to judge others based on your own opinion. For instance, the issue of women and their having abortions. No woman ever does that lightly. And I would not be here today if my mother did not have an abortion because she was going to die. And at that time, nobody was getting abortions unless they were going to die. And I'm very grateful. It was a hard thing for her to decide to do that. She believed she should carry this baby, but if she did that, she would die. And I think we have to be much more careful about how we judge women. No woman who is pregnant wants to have the baby removed just for convenience. Never does that ever happen.
This is Martha again. I think it's hard for people to say what is good about a person or what isn't. But I think if we just think the good is that person which is part of the Lord flowing through them. If you just think that person has God in them just like I do, and that's the good.
And we are at stopping time. Thank you all.